Okay, in this video, let's take a look at just a few of the post-Civil War items that take us up through to about World War I. Now, as I've said before in these previous videos, there are 1,000 topics that you could review, that you could do compare and contrast on. A lot I'm just going to assume that you get, or that you know, or that you've looked at, or that you have the smarts to figure out you should know. Comparison between the North and the South as they entered the Civil War, what their relative strategic positions were and why the South lost, for instance. Or, the difference between U.S. involvement in World War I and World War II. That sort of thing I would think is so obvious you don't need this. The stuff I'm doing is not terribly obscure. It's not stuff that you would miss otherwise, but just a few things that I think might be helpful particularly in keeping things straight so you don't get two related ideas confused. So let's start first with post-Civil War, and really this goes into the 20th century, the two approaches to the problem of racism in the United States. And these are approaches that are still talked about today. So you have Booker T. Washington on one side. And again, we're just summarizing these two guys. You could do a whole semester on both of them, but what's Booker T. Washington? Well, let's compare them this way. Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. Yeah? Okay. Booker T. Washington says racism is a result of slavery. Because blacks were held in servitude, because they were held as slaves, whites first came to look on blacks as something inferior and therefore treat them that way. And second, whites themselves were brutalized. This was something the abolitionists had actually said, that the practice of slavery actually harmed whites by turning them into more brutal people. W.B. Du Bois, on the other hand, took the opposite view, right? That slavery is the result of racism. That whites already looked down on blacks, which is why they felt no problems about enslaving them and treating them as animals in the first place. Okay, Booker T. Washington, what's his way forward? How do you address the problem? Well, self-help. Pulling oneself up by one's own bootstraps. Yeah? So you think about boots, you've got little loops on the side there that help you pull it on. So imagine if you were standing there and tried to bend down, pull on those bootstraps as if by doing so you could lift your feet off the ground and get higher somehow. That's the idea. Blacks should work hard, become skilled craftsmen, tradesmen, and workers. Most Americans were farmers, were shop owners, carpenters, metal workers. They had those sorts of working class hands-on jobs. So why shouldn't blacks do the same thing and become really good at it? The idea is let's do our best to make ourselves economically self-sufficient. Economic advancement and working stability would win respect from whites and conquer racism over time. So if you had a black guy, white guy looks down on the black guy because, well, he's just, a leftover slave and they're not really capable of taking care of themselves and they're not smart enough to do anything. Well, if that black guy becomes the best carpenter in town, really good at his job, really knows his stuff, is seen around town working hard, doing his thing, respectable within his trade and respectable as a member of the society, well, whites over time will come to see that racism doesn't make any sense and they'll accept him as one of their own. Therefore, Booker T. said, vocational education is important for us, helping people become good at their jobs. Therefore, he starts the Tuskegee Normal and Industrial Institute. Now, the word normal there, be a little careful of. Normal in an educational context means teaching. I know I don't even want to get into how that happens, but trust me. So all over the United States years ago, you had what were called normal colleges or normal schools. Those were what we call today the departments of education. Today, if you want to be a teacher, one way to do it, it's not the only way, is to get a degree in education, Bachelor of Science in Education. Well, in those days, you went to a normal college to do that, as it was called. An industrial institute. Tuskegee did not start out as a kind of classical university where you'd go to study Latin and Greek and philosophy. It was a place you went to become really good at a trade or craft. So the technical arts, being a draftsman, being a machine operator or a die maker. These are actually highly skilled jobs, and that was the sort of thing they were training you for, so that you could then go out and compete in the workplace with all the other whites. Yeah. W.B. Du Bois. Well, let me go on. Booker T. Therefore supported accommodation. Let's be tolerant of whites and blacks being socially separate, that is, segregation, but cooperative. So he used the analogy of the hand. The five fingers can all go their separate ways, but when it comes to, moving things forward, they come together and cooperate without losing their separateness. And so his idea was blacks and whites could have their own side-by-side separate societies, but they would cooperate together as sub-communities in the building of a community. Therefore, he opposed movements to abolish the Jim Crow laws. He believed that forced abolition of those laws would backfire. So if you went in and made a law saying you couldn't discriminate, people would resent it. And it would just make sort of the racial hatred worse. So he says economic success would gradually erode racism. So if we did the best we could to make business successes of ourselves, over time, whites would start to lose interest, if you will, in Jim Crow laws, and Jim Crow would just kind of disappear. And so we depended on this idea of gradualism. We had to be patient, you had to wait over time, but eventually if we worked hard and, did the best we could, we would show whites that we were every bit as good as they were. We were not hostile and out to get them, and so whites would say, hey, maybe racism doesn't make sense. The book that he writes several books, but the famous one is Up From Slavery, which is a autobiography. A person connected with him is Timothy Thomas Fortune, who was the publisher of a newspaper called The New Age. The New Age was, at the time, the largest circulation newspaper in the black community across the country. As part of this, Booker T crafted a document called the Atlanta Compromise, which brought together some white leaders in the South and Booker T and some of his friends. The Atlanta Compromise said blacks would work hard and submit to white political power and wouldn't engage in protests or agitation. In return, whites would guarantee that blacks would have the same educational opportunities as whites and would have due process rights in the courts. So basically, it was saying, blacks sort of commit themselves to being good model citizens in the community and won't try to take over the political authority, which was a big threat to whites, right? What if the blacks took over the government? No, we'll stay out of politics and government, but in return, you promise that we will have as much access to education. We may have separate schools, black and white, but we'll be given schools just the same as yours. And when we go to court, we will have the same rights as any white man. So trying to get out of lynching situations and discrimination in court. Okay, the opposite number to Booker T. Washington is W.E.B. Du Bois. As we said, slavery Booker T says racism is the result of slavery. Du Bois says slavery is the result of racism. Racism is deeply built into white society and white consciousness, he says. This is not something that was put there by slavery and so can be undone. This is something that long pre-existed it and is built into them. What's the way forward, therefore, he says, to fight for social change? And so instead of emphasizing let's educate all black people to have trades, he focuses on what he calls the talented 10th, the top 10%, the best, the brightest, the smartest kids, honors student kids, to provide them with intellect, to create leaders. His idea is, Booker T is saying if everybody had a good, solid, working class job, we'd all rise. Du Bois is saying what we need is, if you will, a black Harvard alumni group. We need our own sort of version of the Black Ivy League, kids who are as capable of competing for the very best jobs, the intellectuals, the lawyers, the writers, the thinkers, and then therefore the political leaders. Du Bois emphasizes legal action. The NAACP, National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, is the organization he backs, and they make great use of lawsuits. They go and use every means they can to argue against laws or activities that they say violate things like the Equal Protection Clause in the Constitution, right? All citizens are entitled to equal protection under the law. Well, discrimination, they argue, is not that. And so they use a strategy of bringing cases to court to force courts to rule on these things. The NAACP, of course, is born out of that Niagara movement, which was Du Bois and a bunch of other people who got together and said, Booker T. Washington's way is not working, it's not going to work, we have to come up with something different. And just as you had the Tuskegee Normal and Industrial Institute, Du Bois is based at Atlanta University. Notice it's a university, right? Not a technical institute, which kind of is a bit of the difference between them. Du Bois was against accommodation and against gradualism. He said we need to fight the Jim Crow laws head on now. And we need to get change now, not wait for it, not put up with it, tolerate it until it slowly fades away. And again, he takes sort of the opposite view of Washington. Booker T. Washington says economic success will lead eventually to political rights. Du Bois says fighting for political rights, once we get them, that will lead to economic success. W.D. Du Bois wrote a number of books. Probably the most famous is The Souls of Black Folk. And the publication connected to him is The Crisis, which is the newspaper of the NAACP. And, of course, he opposed the Atlanta Compromise of Washington. Who won? Well, neither won and both won. On the one hand, with W.B. Du Bois, he lived longer. Booker T. Washington died long before Du Bois. But just shortly after his death, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which is the first major law that really bans discrimination, particularly in terms of things like voting and so on. The Voting Rights Act, which will be a follow-up to it, will come a little bit later. These all start to be put into law just after Du Bois' death. So on the one hand, he got what he wanted. On the other hand, Booker T's approach is still talked about today. Bill Cosby, you may know Bill Cosby from TV, is one of those who kind of takes Booker T. Washington's attitude. of let's, our problem is that we're not, that a lot of black people are not taking enough responsibility for making themselves into an economic power. And, when we have our kids getting great educations and going out there and holding down solid jobs, white society will have to take notice of us. There is still racism in America. There are still a lot of racial prejudice around. And, if you look at things like the ability to rise, despite the great American story that, anybody can make it in America, that's not entirely true. Most people stay where they are economically. That is, if you're born into a poor family, chances are you're probably going to die in a poor family. If you're born into a rich family, chances are you're going to die in a rich family. And if you look at a map of poor neighborhoods and you look at a map of black neighborhoods, they're almost identical, in part because it is difficult to rise out. But Cosby and Washington's point would be, what's the most important color in America? Green. And when black consumers have as much money to spend on stuff as white consumers, business is going to stop discriminating. So now I'm not taking sides on this. I'm not saying who's right, who's wrong. My point is that the sort of debate between the two is what's the best way to have racism disappear still goes on with us today. And in a sense, both men have made their points. Both men have had a strong influence on the civil rights movement and on black attitudes. And at the same time, both of them would say that they're also lacking something. They didn't come to the fullness of what they expected. Okay, let's move on. So since we're talking about economics, let's talk about the labor movement quickly. This shouldn't take long. And compare and contrast Knights of Labor and the American Federation of Labor. American Federation of Labor, also known as the AFL or the AF of L. Yeah, you'll hear it talked about either way. Knights of Labor comes a little bit earlier, 1869. The key guy there is Terence Powderly. Again, you can look him up online. Again, he's the guy with the really stupendous facial hair. He is one of the best mustaches in American history. Powderly's idea for the Knights of Labor was that it would be the single organization that would unite all workers across the country, no matter where they were or what their job was, into a single voice of laborers and working people. And from 1860 to 1970, it really grows fast. Within a decade, it's got 700,000 members at its height, which is a lot. What were they advocating? Well, a lot of what we might call reform agenda or progressive ideas. They wanted the abolition of those trusts, monopolies, that really controlled business and trade and prices and things like that. They wanted an 8-hour workday for their workers. They advocated a progressive income tax. Notice two things. First of all, the United States had no income tax at all at that time. The federal government's money came from the tariff, which was a tax on imports, which raised the price of goods for consumers, which is one reason Knights of Labor was not big on the tariff. The wealthy did not pay a heavy share of that. So first, the Knights of Labor is advocating an income tax. Let's have the government make its money by taxing incomes, and a progressive income tax. What a progressive income tax means, that's not a value judgment, by the way, progressive as opposed to regressive. It's a mathematical judgment. Progressive income tax means that the more you make, the larger percentage you pay. So I'm making up numbers here, but if you make $10,000 a year, you pay 10%. If you make $50,000 a year, you pay 20%. If you make $100,000 a year, you pay 30%. The idea being that, if all you're making is, let's say, $1 a day, well, 10% of $1 a day can really hurt you because you're really just barely getting by. On the other hand, 10% of $1 million, you're not even going to notice it's gone. Therefore, their argument is the richer people should pay a larger percentage of their income in taxes. That's the idea of a progressive income tax. There's a progressive stepped set of rates for it. And it's actually the way we have income tax now. What you may hear your parents talk about, tax brackets. That's the steps. If you make over a certain amount, you pay this much, and so on. They were also in favor of child labor laws, at least restricting it, if not abolishing it. And they were early advocates of equal pay for men and women. They were pretty open about who they accepted into the Knights of Labor. Women could be a part of it as much as men. I'm not saying blacks were, welcome everywhere, but there were blacks who were part of Knights of Labor. They were advocates for labor, but they had this vision of society being cooperative. They wanted labor and management to work together, not to fight each other, but the Knights of Labor would be the voice of labor sitting at the table with the voice of management to come to a consensus about how to move forward where everybody benefits. Knights of Labor blow out in 1886. So just about 16, 17 years after they get started. The Haymarket riot, that you should know what that is, was blamed on them. And really completely wrongly. Whatever one thinks of the Haymarket riot or the anarchists or whatever that supported it, then it was really a completely different group from the Knights of Labor. But because everybody sort of put all of those labor activists in one big basket, and the Knights of Labor were the biggest labor group, they got sort of blamed for it, and it really wiped them out. And by the 1890s, the Knights of Labor had almost ceased to exist. Okay, let's compare that to the American Federation of Labor, that gets started a bit later, 1886. So just as the Knights of Labor are getting blown out, the American Federation of Labor comes in. The guy there is Samuel Gompers. Samuel Gompers is a big, jowly, ham-faced guy, an immigrant and a cigar roller. The AFL was different from the Knights of Labor. The Knights of Labor was one gigantic union. Everybody was a member who was a worker. The AFL was a collection, a federation of individual, what are called craft unions. So there was a separate union for cigar rollers, and there was a separate union for plumbers, and a separate union for carpenters, and a separate union for machinists, and a separate union for die makers, or whatever else. Each of them had their own organization, but then they joined together as in this federation of organizations that they could all meet together, keeping their own separate identities within that. What that meant was, first of all, mere laborers were not part of the AFL. If you were just a ditch digger or just a pair of strong hands, no. Craft unions were for skilled labor. So some job that you had to have some training for. And so, just sort of regular run-of-the-mill day laborers were not part of this. Blacks were not really welcome. Women were not really welcome. Yet, it grows hugely too. Within the same period of time, within 15, 16 years, it's up to 1.4, 1.5 million members. So twice as big as the Knights of Labor, even though it's not representing as many different groups. And, therefore a powerful voice of labor. And I just point out it's actually still around today. The AFL still exists. It doesn't nearly have the power it used to. Really, up through the 1950s, labor, and the AFL in particular, was ginormous as a political force. But a far smaller percentage of the workforce today is unionized. There are few companies left that have real unions anymore, and so the AFL is much shrunken. Okay, now what did the AFL advocate for? Here they're advocating for economic issues, not reformist issues. So they want collective bargaining. That is, instead of a company making a contract with each individual guy, they make a contract with the union. The union negotiates, and therefore the management can't sort of divide up guys and get them against each other. All of the workers, all of the machinists in a shop are together, and they all get the same contract. And therefore, you can have strikes. All of the machinists can say, we're going to walk out and shut down your factory until you're willing to pay us. What are they advocating for? Better wages, more money, better working hours, so 8-hour days, 40-hour weeks, and work rules, safety in the workplace, that sort of thing, for their own members. Those are economic issues. That's about getting my guy who's signing a contract a better deal from his employer. It's not getting into reformist political stuff like child labor laws or progressive income taxes or worried about the trusts and the economy and the effect they're having on everybody. These are big, for the most part, big issues. So when the Knights of Labor advocated for these, it wasn't necessarily helping the guy who's a member of the Knights of Labor. They were helping society. Here, the AFL is so successful in part because it ignores all of that, and it focuses on, here's my member, here's a member of the machinist union, how do I get him a better deal from his employer? Yeah? Okay. Let's move on. This will be short, quick, easy. Gospel of wealth versus social gospel. I just want to make sure that you keep the two separate and you remember which is which, basically. Gospel of wealth is a term that really comes from Andrew Carnegie. Or I shouldn't say that. He doesn't really use the term, but he writes an essay called Savage Wealth. That's the essay he writes. You can look it up online if you want. Carnegie's basic idea is that wealth is responsibility. Yeah. Don't forget, Andrew Carnegie. Well, Andrew Carnegie's a really, really, really fascinating guy. There's a pretty good series. I mentioned this, I think, on the History Channel, or if you go, which is whatever that is, Channel 40, I think. But up the dial, up in the 100s someplace, there's a History Channel 2 that they show this on sometimes. There's a series called The Men Who Made America. And it's about John D. Rockefeller, J.P. Morgan, and Andrew Carnegie, with some other characters thrown in there, like Henry Frick. Carnegie is a fascinating guy. He is an immigrant, comes over here basically with nothing, works his way up, becomes the owner of the largest steel works on the planet, and really his wealth sort of explodes because he has a deliberate makes a deliberate decision to outdo John D. Rockefeller. The story goes that Carnegie had started off working for the Pennsylvania Railroad, which was another great business of the time, and a guy named Thomas Scott was the head of it. The story goes that Scott was driven to an early grave by the ruthlessness that John Rockefeller used against him in business, and that Carnegie never forgave Rockefeller for it. That may or may not be true. There is a lot of dispute about that. Um, but what is true is, what's also true is Carnegie had a sort of, there was a remorse to him and a certain degree of guilt about the ruthlessness of the business practices that had gone on as he came up and made his wealth. Whatever, the feelings were about it, he also looked around at the newly rich people around him, the Vanderbilts and Rockefeller, among others, and saw that a lot of these fortunes were being spent on nonsense. Self-indulgence, luxury, sloth, and drunkenness. And he believed, he was in his own way a religious guy. He believed that wealth, if you acquired it, you have an obligation to use it for the common good, not just sit on it and indulge yourself by, building yourself palaces. He had some really nice houses, but with all that extra money, you were supposed to do something about it. And so he spends his money. The Carnegie Foundation, Carnegie Mellon University, that should be singular university. I don't know why I did that. Andrew Mellon was one of his business partners. The Carnegie Library system, he went across the country building tons and tons of libraries. And why? Why those things? Oh, I should also point out, actually, I should mention here, come to think of it, he also, I'll just leave it. He also paid for the Tuskegee Institute. Booker T. Washington, he actually helped pay for that, among other things. Why? Because he believed that you had an obligation to use your money for the common good. You had an obligation to use it to shorten the gap between the super wealthy and the average guy, and that you did it by creating ladders upon which aspiring people can rise. Meaning, you did it by giving people the means to move up in the world, rather than just, handing out money to the poor to keep them poor. He said, let me build libraries across the country. Understand something. Libraries were not just there for entertainment. I know you guys, you live in a world where you can call up anything you want on the computer, and so public libraries may seem kind of superfluous to you. But the public libraries were a critical part of the education system. If you were too poor to go to university, and most people were, you could go to the Carnegie Library, and for free, you could take out any book they had. If you were in a big city like New York City had its own public library system, has its own public library system. You could take out any book that the public library had anywhere in its system. They would, you could have it sent to your local branch library. And in New York in particular, that meant any book in the world. An ambitious, hard-working kid with some intelligence and a little bit of guidance could give themselves the equivalent of a Harvard education by reading. And there were a lot of American young people who educated themselves that way and became, in the early 20th century, the great entrepreneurs, the great new engineers, the great new inventors. I mean, particularly in those days, you didn't need a degree. Thomas Edison, the light bulb, the telephone, the phonograph, talking movies, etc., etc. Thomas Edison never really went to high school. You didn't need a degree in engineering that allowed you to become an inventor. You just went out and you did something. And so the Carnegie libraries were not just there as vague, boring entertainment for the masses. He really meant them to be kind of the free university of everybody. He built Carnegie Mellon University out in Pittsburgh, where his steelworks were, as an opportunity to this day, Carnegie Mellon is one of the great universities with great deal for people who go there financially, and particularly is great for things like engineering. Although that's not the only thing it's good for. But so that was his idea. Let's give people a way to move up. We have an obligation to do that. That spirit got caught for one reason or another by a lot of other people, including Rockefeller. The University of Chicago, which is in Chicago, is truly, by everybody's measure, just as good as Harvard, Yale, Princeton. Even though more people sort of, particularly in the East Coast, know the name, University of Chicago is, believe me, every bit as good. And John Rockefeller built the University of Chicago. In New York, we have a thing called Rockefeller University, which you haven't heard of probably because it's not a university in the usual sense. You can't. It's not really a place you go normally for like a bachelor's degree in marketing or something. It's a specialized research center that does medical research. Some of you may be familiar with Sloan Kettering, Memorial Sloan Kettering. That's connected with Rockefeller University. There is a Rockefeller Institute. There is a Rockefeller Foundation, which gives out money to all kinds of causes, and others too. Vanderbilt, the Vanderbilt family gave a lot of money to things. Cornelius actually gave a gigantic donation to the University of Tennessee, so they renamed it Vanderbilt University. That was part of the deal when he gave them the money. But then that became a thing. If you were super wealthy, you had to have a foundation named after you. Henry Clay Frick, who was Carnegie's attack dog. Frick was a pretty vicious guy. And Carnegie hired him because Carnegie was kind of in his own way, a nice guy, and he needed an attack dog to try to break the unions. Anyway, if you know anything about art, you should have heard of the Frick Gallery or the Frick Collection in Manhattan, which is his mansion. He had this gigantic mansion. He's dead now, obviously, but the Frick Mansion up in Midtown now houses his art collection. J.P. Morgan, who was the big financier and deal maker in all this, the Morgan Library is named for him. It's not part of the public library system, but it's part of the it's its own research library. So anyway, that became the thing to do. A lot of them did it for PR purposes, to give themselves a better image with the public. Carnegie really did it out of a sincere belief in this gospel of wealth. Okay, enough about that. Flip side of this is social gospel. Don't get the two confused. They don't really have anything to do with each other. The social gospel is an idea that was taking place in religious organizations around the same time, sort of launched by Walter Rauschenbusch. Walter Rauschenbusch was a Protestant minister. Now I want to make something clear here. The social gospel thing was really a Protestant Christian movement. The Catholic Church has always had as part of its theology the necessity of doing good works. Protestant theology has traditionally, you may remember from Luther, been uncomfortable with that idea. Not that they believe that you should do bad things or something, but that they don't want the theology of having, if you do good works to earn your way into heaven. The Catholic Church does not believe in that either. If you do enough good works, it doesn't earn you your way into heaven. Grace is a free gift from God for Catholics too. But we've always had more an emphasis that, as the letter of the Apostle James says, faith without works is dead. If you claim to have faith in God, but you're not showing it in works, you're kind of lying to yourself. So the Catholic Church has always been big on running orphanages, helping the poor, um, advocating for social justice, and like that. Protestant Church in America, particularly, not so much, until Walter Rauschenbusch comes along and gives a series of sermons, writes books and things, that basically says Christianity has social implications. He doesn't use this phrase, I'm using it to summarize it. Christianity is about love. Well, there can be no love without justice first. So we have an obligation to make society a more just place. This was a largely urban thing. Rauschenbusch and the people like him are looking around at late 1800s, massive influxes of immigration, and therefore huge slums in the cities, massive poverty, discrimination, hatred for the incoming Italians, hatred for the incoming Eastern Europeans, Jews, crime, which ratchets up in those situations, a lack of social service and support. And, this is a major, major problem. So his attitude is churches have the responsibility to lead in providing social services, not just charitable handouts. He's not just saying, well, it's a good thing to go out and give out free soup and bread. He's saying it's a Christian imperative to make society a better place, if you will, to get behind progressive causes, to push for change in law and so on. It's not just an optional extra. Okay, so keep the two straight. The social gospel is a change, particularly in American Protestant thought, about what the responsibility of a Christian is in building society. The gospel of wealth is not as religious as it looks. It's Andrew Carnegie saying, if you have a lot of money, you have an obligation to use it for the common good, and particularly for helping those who do aspire, helping those if people who are willing to work hard and are willing to try and strive. We have an obligation to give them a helping hand through things like education. Okay, and then we move on to populism and progressivism. So during the same period of time, late 1800s, you have these two parallel movements. And once again, they have some interrelationship, but keep them straight. Populism, when you hear the word populism, you should be thinking about farmers. It's a farmers movement and farming country in the South and Midwest. So it's, you don't necessarily have to own a farm, but if you've got a small grocery store in a little town that's surrounded by farming communities, you're also part of this. So it's South and out in the Midwest. And populism is all about protecting their interest, the things they're worried about. Things like the high tariff. High tariff, for them, simply raises prices. High tariff can be good for business. High tariff can be good for industrial workers. But for farmers, it kills you. It just raises the prices of everything you have to buy. Railroad rates. They believe that railroad rates were discriminatory. The railroad rates were targeted, and really the small farmer was screwed by railroad rates. If you were a big conglomerate major business that owned a lot of farms, you did better. The small farmer was the one who got screwed. So they wanted government control of the railroads, to step in and have the government either run the railroads themselves or at least set the rates. I'm going to go off on a small tangent here, but it was just something thinking about the other day. Anybody know where time zones come from? Eastern time, Central time, Mountain time, Pacific time. Comes from the railroads. If you wanted to set people normally, when they didn't move by railroad, they could just go by whatever the local sun time was. So noon was when the sun was directly overhead. But every few miles that changes, because as you go around, as you go across the country, noon is going to be what it looks like to you, and you have to wait for the Earth to turn, right? The railroads couldn't run that way. You had to have a uniform set of time. So the whole East Coast, all the way out till you started to get to Chicago, if a train left Pittsburgh headed to New York, and a train left New York headed to Pittsburgh, if they didn't have their watches synchronized, if they both didn't think it was 11 o'clock, they would be on the wrong tracks, and they could collide with each other. Yeah? So the New York train knew that it had to get off the track and go on a siding at 11:30 because the Pittsburgh train was coming in the other direction. And then once Pittsburgh train passed, you'd get off the siding and back onto the main track. If your watches were screwed up, you were going to collide because you didn't have radios or anything to warn each other. So the railroads have to invent a system of time zones so that everybody in this zone is working on this clock and everybody in the Midwest is working on this clock. It's one of those little things we take for granted that we don't realize comes from a specific business in the industrial age. Anyway, to get back to what I was talking about. So populists, they wanted the government either to run the railroads themselves or at least to control the rates. Populists also were against the gold standard. They wanted free coinage of silver. What's that about? Basically, for a farmer, more money in circulation is better. Yeah, if you plant your crop now, if you borrow $100, and wheat is $100 a bushel, and you plant your crop now, then when you sell it in the fall, if there is inflation, that is, if wheat is now worth $200 a bushel, you sell the wheat, you pay the bank back its $100, and you make $100 on top of it. On the other hand, if you're stuck with the gold standard, it's harder for you to make money because the amount of money in circulation is not going to change. And so, at the end of the growing season, you have to pay the bank back in more tightly controlled money. So they wanted free coinage of silver. The more money in circulation, the better for them. And they were also about reforming political power. Remember, up until this time, up until the late 1800s, and you can go look up the amendment and you should know what it says, senators were elected by the state legislature. House of Representatives elected by the people, senators elected by the state legislature, so they therefore represented the state government, which was largely controlled by big political machines and big business guys. They wanted popular election of senators by the people, which is what we have now, so that it wasn't in the control of the state legislature, of the handful of guys in the state capitol that you had a hard time influencing. Remember, the populist movement really grows out of the Grange movement and so on. If you don't know what that is, you better look it up. And populism had its own kind of racism. There was not... The populists were white farmers, basically. There were black farmers in the country, but they were not... There wasn't really cooperation between the white farmers and the black farmers. Populism eventually becomes a third party, the Populist Party, and it helps to back William Jennings Bryan, again, a guy you should know. William Jennings Bryan was really a Democrat, but the Populist Party backed him as well. Populist elements of the Democratic Party. Runs for president, 1896, is defeated. And after that defeat, the populists kind of lose a lot of power. William McKinley, who is a Republican and is really the candidate of big business. It's really Rockefeller and Carnegie and Morgan and those guys who pay to get him elected. McKinley is much more sympathetic to the big businesses, the industrialists, the East Coast, the bankers, which is the opposite of the populists. Okay, let's look at the progressivists for a minute. Progressivism, different movement, different group happening at the same time. Not in conflict with populists, really, but the two are separate issues. Progressivists are mostly urban types. They're mostly middle and upper class people, educated types, who are looking to reform society. So these are people in New York, in Boston, in Chicago, in some of these cities, who look at the problems not of the farmer, but of the cities, and say, we have to fix this somehow. What are the progressivists all about? Well, things like government involvement in social problems. That's what they want, is the government. The attitude had been that the federal government, the smallest government possible, is best. The federal government should basically stay out of everybody's lives as much as possible. Progressivists are saying the federal government should be the instrument by which society tries to solve social problems. So you think about the urban issues of the time. Poverty, slums that we talked about. The issues that immigrants faced, the exploitation that went on of immigrants, political and economic. They got off the boat, they didn't know what they were doing, and they often had their stuff stolen. The girls were kind of tricked into becoming prostitutes. They quickly lost whatever money they had, so they became dependent on people willing to exploit them for business. Political corruption, high crime, drinking, drunkenness, alcoholism that was running rampant in many of these communities. And I say industrial issues, things like the trusts and the monopolies that are exploiting people, things like child labor, things like, to some degree, the labor movement, that sort of business, and rights for women as well. So what are they pushing for? They too want popular election of senators. They too want progressive income tax. We talked about that before with the Knights of Labor. And like the populists, like the Knights of Labor, everybody's kind of in favor of this idea of popular election of senators to get it out of the hands of the political clubs. The temperance movement, what we would call the prohibition movement later on. The progressivists are already doing that. By the 1870s, I mentioned this to you, Coca-Cola gets invented because in the 1870s, Georgia has already forbidden alcohol. As I said to you, if you go through the neighborhood of Westerly on Staten Island, you drive around Westerly and you see all of these street signs over there that are named for states: Alabama, Maine, Georgia, etc. Those are all states that had already gone dry, had put in prohibition before the federal government does. You see names of Clinton B. Fisk and people like that over there. Those are all the political candidates. Neil Dow. Those are all presidential political candidates for the Prohibition movement. And Westerly was known as Prohibition Park. It was a settlement of pro-prohibition people who were largely involved with this progressivist stuff. They were also into women's rights. They were already talking about suffrage for women, right, the right to vote. And business regulations, regulations on the monopolies, the trusts, consumer regulations, pure food and drug issues, because a lot of businesses were putting all kinds of garbage into food as a way to sort of water down the milk and stuff like that. Oddly enough, the progressivists didn't so much get involved in the racist issues. They didn't really have much to say when it came to discrimination against blacks. Like the populists, the progressivists, or the progressives, become their own third party. Ted Roosevelt, even though he's a Republican, is a very progressive Republican. He's in favor of a lot of these things. After he's president, William Howard Taft becomes president. At first, Roosevelt supports him, but then he thinks that Taft is too close to business and so on. So, in the election of 1912, right? Yes, 1912. Roosevelt runs on a third party. So you have Taft and Wilson, Woodrow Wilson, the Democrat, and Teddy Roosevelt running as the Bull Moose Party, it was called, which the real name of it was the Progressive Party. Interesting that they all claim to be progressives. Teddy called himself a progressive. Woodrow Wilson was being elected because he had been governor of New Jersey and had cleaned up political corruption there. And Taft also claimed to be, he actually did more trust busting than Teddy did, believe it or not. But so you had that heritage there, but they became a third. Woodrow Wilson won, and so the Progressive Party disappears, but a lot of what they wanted to get done eventually actually gets done. Wilson goes for it, or you have the Volstead Act, the 19th Amendment, Prohibition, and so the progressive movement, if you will, starts to decline in World War I, and it's going to morph into something else as you get after that. Okay, and then last, let's talk a bit about foreign policy during this period and compare imperialism, which is what's going on in this period, with a previous policy, a previous attitude called manifest destiny, which you should remember. And this should be easy. I'll just run through this quick. We talk about don't get them confused. That's kind of what I'm going for here. They're two separate things. Don't get them confused. Manifest destiny, pre-Civil War movement. It's really Well, it kind of starts with the Louisiana Purchase, really with Jefferson, and all the way up through the Civil War. The idea is that the United States has been given a mission by God to spread this new thing from sea to shining sea. We started on the East Coast, and we have an obligation. We have been given a gift by God to go all the way to the Pacific coast and fill in this continent that we've been handed with this perfect government. In a way, some of the idea goes back to the city set on a hill. We remember this from the Massachusetts colony, right? That colony thought of itself as a divinely inspired thing, meant to be an example to the world of how to build a society. Well, that concept, it changed its manifestation over time, but even today, today we don't call it this. Today we call it American exceptionalism. That's the phrase in 2014, but it's all the same idea, that America is something special and unique in human history. Not just because we live here and, oh, well, ain't it great, but that this idea of a democratic republic with a Bill of Rights, which the government is dependent on the people, and you have the freedom to do whatever you want as long as you don't interfere with somebody else. A lot of that is not, in fact, true in day-to-day life, but this is the theory we have about ourselves as Americans. That idea, whether you call it the city set on a hill, or manifest destiny, or the white burden, the white man's burden, or American exceptionalism, it's all kind of the same thing. God has given this nation a mission. Before the Civil War, manifest destiny, our job is to fill in this continent he's given us. The phrase comes from 1845. John O'Sullivan is a journalist who is writing about the fact that the United States has an obligation, he thinks, to go for the Oregon Territory, to take it, to hold it against the rest of the world, Britain and everybody else, and spread America all the way to the coast. God gave us this land to undertake the great experiment of liberty and federated self-government, right? Its manifestations are things like all of the purchases that are made, the Gadsden Purchase and originally the Louisiana Purchase and like that, but also things like James Knox Polk, the Mexican War, where we go to war with Mexico really so that we can take that whole territory that we call the American Southwest. And it gets us all the way from the Louisiana Purchase, which is really the Mississippi River down to the south there, across Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, all of that to California. At the time, the abolitionists noted the irony. We're doing this so that we can spread freedom from coast to coast, except that freedom also includes slavery in the new territories. All right. Compare that with imperialism. Imperialism is the term we give to foreign policy in the 1890s and after. Before the from the Civil War through the 1890s, you don't have either of these really exactly active. You always have that concept in American thought of we are special, but you don't have active. Why? Because we've after the Civil War, we've expanded coast to coast. The United States of America now takes up from the Atlantic to the Pacific. So there's not really any more to expand upon. So we're busy filling in the middle. The Homestead Act and all that kind of stuff. We're organizing. We've made it all the way coast. Now we have to go back and figure out, all right, how do we divide up everything, Montana and Iowa and all of this into states, and start working on this. Although Iowa was already a state by the Civil War, but all of the Oregon and Washington State, all that. How do we organize this into states? By the time you get to the 1890s, we're starting to look now outside of the continental United States, and we have this phrase, "the white man's burden." It's a very racist thought, but this is what people thought. We, white Americans, were civilized. We had civilization. And all that goes with it, we had discovered the correct form of government, the correct attitude toward human rights, and blah, blah, blah. And therefore we had an obligation to bring this to all of those people who didn't have it yet because they were too dumb or stupid to be able to achieve it. And so it's the white man's burden to go all around the world and spread the ideas of civilization, culture, democracy. Oh, by the way, and also, the United States needed stuff. You have the explosion of the industrialization of the country, and so the United States had this hunger for raw material and places to sell the stuff that we were making. The United States, one of its great strengths is that we have so much raw material here. We have so much coal and iron and so on, but there's a lot of stuff we don't have here. There's rubber, there's all kinds of tropical products. So they needed more raw material, and they needed places to sell things. All right. So McKinley, Roosevelt, Taft, and to some degree Wilson engage in this imperialistic attitude. You have McKinley with the Spanish-American War. And what happens with the Spanish-American War? Oh, well, we're there to liberate the Cubans who were rebelling against their Spanish overlords. Isn't that nice? That's nice. But somehow, coming out of that war, which we are fighting to stop Spain from having an empire, we wind up owning Puerto Rico, the Philippines, Guam, and Wake, these islands out in the Pacific, among other territories. And we make Cuba, or we try to make Cuba, we really do make Cuba economically dependent on the United States. So even though we don't own it, it's effectively an economic colony. And that's true of a lot of the other Caribbean countries that are down there. We turn them into basically economic dependencies. What else happens in this period? The United States gets its hands on Hawaii. The United States gets its hands, it invents the country of Panama, really, and builds the Panama Canal right through it. That's Teddy Roosevelt. We get involved in Central America, in Nicaragua, in El Salvador, in the Caribbean again, in Haiti. Notice the differences in your diplomacy here. You have the big stick diplomacy that's Roosevelt, who's willing to use military force to spread American influence. You have dollar diplomacy, that's Taft, who figures out ways to make these countries debtor nations so that they owe so much money to American banks that we can effectively set policy down there. And even Wilson, although Wilson comes into office wanting to sort of claiming to change all that, in fact, once he gets in, he kind of does the same thing. He's got U.S. troops involved in Haiti. So there's the irony, too. We are a great country because we are a democracy, self-governing, where each man, one vote, and everybody participates in government. And in order to spread that wonderfulness, we turn Puerto Rico and the Philippines and Hawaii and Panama into colonies of the United States. It is kind of ironic. Okay. Again, I hope this was helpful to you, and I'll do one more of these. Hopefully I'll have it up on Friday, certainly over the weekend sometime. That will take us through into the 20th century. Let me just check my notes here and make sure that that's what I'm doing. Yeah, that's what I'm doing. We're going to do one more. I'm going to do one more of these, I think, to get us through from about 1920, from about World War I through to the present. If people want other topics covered, if you would find it helpful for me to do something about a specific topic that's confusing you or you can't keep straight, you need to speak up. Say something in class, send me an email, post something on one of the many forums that I have running on the website, but something, and I will do what I can to do another lecture, either here or I will simply do it after school, whatever is going to be most helpful to you, to cover, whatever topics you think would be useful. And if you need something different from this, again, you need to speak up. If you need me to go through specific terms, these are kind of all broad and general, or explain some individual specific event or something, let me know about that.